Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website and have that one housekeeping task. Please check that your cell phones have been turned off as a courtesy to our speakers. We will post the program within 24 hours on the Heritage website again for everyone's future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Introducing our program this morning is my colleague Ray Hederman. Mr. Hederman is Director of our Center for Data Analysis. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good morning and welcome again to Heritage. We're truly delighted to have such an esteemed group of academics and scholars here for what I think is a very important contribution to kind of the public discussion on economic fiscal policy, both here and abroad. You know, if everything in real estate is all about location, 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 then I think policy and public policy and politics is all about timing. Timing is everything, and today's discussion is particularly well timed. As a result of the most recent government funding and debt deal, Congress agreed on new budget negotiations in an attempt to set new fiscal policy for the United States. And one of the key focuses on this is what will be done about government spending in terms of trying to raise in our large and growing debt. Liberals, on the other hand, are looking to override sequester spending cuts and increase government spending in an attempt to boost the economic growth similar to what we saw in 2009. Today, Europe is again an example for U.S. policymakers, even if it is an example of maybe what to avoid. People on the left decry European austerity as a reason why growth rates in large European Union countries like France remain lackluster. This is why they argue that the budget spending cuts enacted under the Budget Control Act should be overridden. Government spending should be increased in an attempt to boost economic growth. And indeed, many European countries are suffering from limited growth, and they have announced plans to reduce their fiscal deficits and try to tackle their growing debt. Some liberals in Congress have seized on this as proof that Europe has indeed embarked on an epic round of belt-tightening at the expense of their people and jobs. This fabled American version of the grand bargain between higher taxes and lower spending cuts has been seen as the European Union has a reason of why they need to rein in their debt at possibly the expense of their economy. However, I believe one of the shocking findings of this research is that proclamations and claims by governments and politicians may turn out to be different in reality. Promised spending cuts often do not occur, as new reasons to spend continue to arise. We see emergency spending overridden promised debt reductions, and reduced spending constantly seems to be a good idea, but not right now, not today, and maybe not tomorrow either. Heritage is proud and pleased to host our distinguished panel today to comment on European austerity, both myth and reality. We believe that the research today here will make a strong contribution to understanding European fiscal policy of the last several years and the applicable lessons to policymakers here in the United States. A unique contribution today is a new data series that Heritage is making publicly available to all researchers, and you'll be hearing more about this new data set, what it is, how you can access it, and what we intend researchers to be able to use it for later on this morning. It is my particular pleasure to introduce one of the driving forces behind the project in today's event, my colleague, Dr. Salim Firth. Salim has become a leading voice on European austerity with testimony before Congress and several publications on European austerity. Today's event is due in no small part to his energy and zeal in assembling the distinguished panel you will see today. Dr. Firth's core focus is on how public policy affects macroeconomic growth, and is a senior policy analyst in the Center for Data Analysis here at Heritage. Before joining Heritage in 2012, Dr. Firth was a visiting assistant professor of economics at Amherst College and a visiting research scholar at Northeastern. He receives his PhD in economics at the University of Rochester, and please join me in welcoming Salim Firth.
Thank you guys for being here. Great to see such a large turnout for an event that I think a lot of people would feel like they were at risk of falling asleep from. I want to welcome today's speakers to Heritage, and we're really pleased and honored to have each of you here. And I'd like to introduce the next three speakers, then just to give you a roadmap of where the event is going, since I know we're going to be here for a while. I'll talk a little bit about my own research, which is presented in a working paper that you hopefully received on your way in. We'll have three speakers, and then a short seventh-inning stretch in honor of the Red Sox. And Professor Alesina will speak after that, and then we'll close with a panel discussion with everybody back on the stage and some Q&A. So the next speaker following myself is going to be Véronique de Rougy. She is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She earned her PhD at the Sorbonne, has published on fiscal policy, and is actively engaged in the ongoing debate about U.S. fiscal policy. With Professor Alesina, she co-authored the first chapter of Heritage's new report, Europe's Fiscal Crisis Revealed, the report you got on the way in. In that chapter, they discuss an extensive academic literature about how best to perform fiscal consolidations. Daniel Lee is a senior economist at the research department of the IMF. He earned his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He's an economist's economist with peer-reviewed research on a variety of macro and international economics topics. Two of his recent papers stand out. With IMF chief economist Olivier Blanchard, he wrote a paper using forecast errors to show that fiscal multipliers were larger than forecasters believed early in the crisis. And in another paper with some other IMF co-authors, he's compiled a narrative. Now, when economists say narrative, we're still just talking about numbers. But a narrative of fiscal consolidations over the past several decades, and that narrative was an important contribution to our understanding of austerity and has already been used by Professor Alesina and others in research. And then finally, Kevin Hassett is the John G. Searle Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and AEI's Director of Economic Policy. His PhD is from the University of Pennsylvania. Before joining AEI, he was a senior economist at the Fed and an associate professor of economics and finance at Columbia University Business School. His extensive experience in policy, including as a consultant to the Treasury during the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. Most relevant to today's discussion, together with Andrew Biggs and Matthew Jensen, he wrote a guide for deficit reduction in the United States based on historical consolidations that worked. In addition to being able to have very distinguished guest speakers, we're making available today two pieces of Heritage's own research. One is the working paper that you received, and the other is an online data compendium, which you can download in Excel and play around with if that's your sort of thing. I had a difference of opinion back in June with an impolite Rhode Islander, and that episode really showed me how inaccessible were the data on fiscal policy for the most recent years. And so the goal of this data compendium is to put together in one place data series from a lot of different sources. And hopefully with this data resource, we can have a more informed debate about policy. We present in the compendium a variety of measures, and we'll continue to add more as this project progresses. Now, let me say a few words about economic measurement in general. No economic measure is dispositive. Even figures as widely used as GDP and unemployment rate have recognized flaws. And if a theory performs well only with one particular type of measure, then it could be that the theory is flawed as well. And that's why in the compendium and in today's discussion, we're going to use a variety of different measures, sometimes conflicting, even though they're all purporting to measure the same thing. At the risk of occasional confusion, this is the way to get it right. So let me get into a little bit of what I found. I'm just going to kind of sort of describe the data that as I found it in digging. So I'm going to have a series of slides. A lot of them are going to be a little too small for you to read. All of these pictures are in the working paper as well, and you can find them on our website. So for the data I gathered, I picked 37 countries, Europe plus developed economies elsewhere. Most of the data series that I use begin between 2007 and 2010 and end in the latest year of data available. One of the measurements used here is my own modest contribution to the ways to try and measure discretionary fiscal policy. I call it core government spending, and it takes total expenditures as measured by the OECD and subtracts transfers and interest payments. And the result of that new measure tracks quite closely with the OECD's own measure of government output for whatever that's worth. So my first point in my remarks today is that the data show that generalizations aren't very helpful. So if we look at the whole period, 2007 to 2012, the first thing that I noticed was an odd relationship between spending and revenues. I expected, as many of you probably expect, that I would find some countries that had generally austere policies and other countries that had generally stimulative policies. To put that another way, I expected tax increases to be correlated with spending cuts and spending increases to be correlated with tax cuts. Instead, as this chart sort of shows, the data is very messy, first of all, and there's a weak relationship in the opposite direction. And this confirms to me that the generalizations about European austerity obscure more than they reveal. Now, we can look separately, this is looking at the whole period 2007 to 2012. We could split that up into a stimulus era at the beginning and then an austerity era at the end, though again, those are pretty unhelpful generalizations, as we're going to see. And I will note as an aside that Chapter 3 in the report, which was authored by Matthew Melchiorre, argues that there are big differences in the timing of austerity across countries. Both approaches are worthwhile, using eras or specific dates, and Matthew and I find similar results despite using different approaches and different data. So my second point, let's look at the stimulus here. My second point is that published stimulus plans may not have been followed, particularly the tax cuts that were planned. Now, in the stimulus era, 2007 to 2009 or 2010, countries published lots of fiscal plans, lots and lots of fiscal plans. The compendium has several sets of these plans, and they all look pretty similar because they draw on the same original sources. The tricky part is evaluating whether those plans were carried out. As an aside, if anyone who's participating in this program knows of a rigorous post-mortem on the execution of stimulus plans across countries, please do share it with me. We'd love to include that in the compendium. If we plot one of the stimulus plans against the actual change in spending from 2007 to 2010, the results don't match up particularly well. But at least here with spending, the directions are consistent. Most countries planned to increase spending and did so. So if you can see the picture, the countries that are in the upper right-hand quadrant are the ones that both said they planned to increase spending and then in the measurement that I use, did so subsequently. And so it's a sort of a bunch. They don't look like the amount that they said they were going to increase spending matches up terribly well with the actual increase that occurred, but at least the direction is right. Taxes look significantly worse than that. While most countries reported plans to cut taxes, they're on the left-hand side of the graph, just half of them actually had a declining revenue rate from 2007 to 2009. So those would be the half on the bottom half of the graph. There's just not a lot of countries there. We're not seeing the same pattern of the direction even matching up, let alone the amounts. There are other things, of course, that influence this data. Foremost among those is a major recession, which ought to lower the revenue rate. In a recession, incomes fall, so people move to lower tax brackets and pay a lower average rate. People lose their jobs and stop paying taxes at all. Corporate profits and capital gains shrink drastically, so those tax bills are lowered. So if you change no policies, I expect you to get counted as a tax cutter. If you go through a recession, measuring 2007 to 2009, almost all these countries, I think all the countries in this graph, have a shrinking GDP. So I really expect a country that had no policy changes at all to have a lower revenue rate show up in the bottom half of this graph. So implicitly, my data is biased. It's biased towards finding tax cutters even if they aren't there. But instead, what I find is that half the countries managed to increase their revenue rates from 2007 to 2009. We can look another way to look at the data is to look for specific tax code changes. So if we look at this is a more of a narrative approach, and this clearly shows a shift, a temporal shift from tax cuts in 2008 towards tax increases in 2010 and beyond. So in this graph, you can see there's a large frequency. This is the number of tax changes across countries. So eight different countries cut their top marginal tax rate in 2008. That number declines later in the crisis and in the years following, whereas the number of countries increasing their top marginal tax rate jumps in 2010 and remains high. But again, there's a risk of generalizing from the averages here, because once you look at the data on a country-by-country basis, the countries that cut taxes in 2008, 2009 are not, for the most part, the same countries that raised them in 2010, 11, and 12. So there are some countries that cut taxes early, and then there are mostly a different set of countries that raised these tax rates later. We could also look at value-added taxes. These are basically tax rates I chose because there's a lot of data on them. And that's even more one-sided. There are in the 27 countries that I have data for, 2 of them cut the standard value-added tax rate as temporary stimulus. But 17 of the 27 ended 2012, or actually 2013 now, with higher VAT rates than they had in 2007. So here's just a sample. This is one of 3 pages of these VAT increases. You see this trend towards higher VAT rates. This brings us to the austerity era. So the IMF's Fiscal Monitor publication has a very nice data set which presents estimates of fiscal changes in several categories undertaken since 2009. And those Fiscal Monitor numbers line up very well with other fiscal measures over the same time period, such as change in structural balance, my core spending measure, and the revenue rate. So this slide shows the Fiscal Monitor data, spending cuts with interest payment changes taken out, matched up against the core government spending cuts. And the relationship here is pretty tight, and the average is pretty close to 1-to-1. So we see that we're looking at 2 different data sets with different methodologies, and they look like they're telling the same story. And there's obviously some differences. As you get close to 0, some of these changes are real small, but particularly for the countries that made big policy changes, 2 different ways of measuring show pretty much the same result. And that's good. And we can show the same pattern for revenue changes. The IMF's track of these, the Fiscal Monitor particularly, their track of policy changes on the revenue side match up very well with the revenue rate variable, again, almost 1-to-1. And this is good. It gives us added confidence when we're looking at either of these data sources. We see this some confirmation. And it's really an indictment of the stimulus plans in terms of their accuracy, because when we compare the Fiscal Monitor to these measures taken directly from the data, well, they look very similar. But the stimulus plans don't look very similar to those. And so we have some confirmation for the data. Okay, if we have data sources that are different, they all kind of look the same, but these stimulus plans look very different. That leads me to have less confidence that these stimulus plans were carried out in the magnitudes that they were planned. And that, looking forward, gives us a good reason to be skeptical about plans that are published now. If you don't already have a skepticism towards announced fiscal plans, this would be a good time to start. And then I finally want to answer the question, just how austere has the world been so far in this era of austerity, and in what ways? And I'll rely on the Fiscal Monitor numbers for this section. Here's a screen grab from the online data compendium. This data can be yours too for the low price of your time. There are 28 countries in the Fiscal Monitor. The median fiscal consolidation is 2% of GDP spread over 3 years. Now that's not very much, and it doesn't match the descriptions of brutal or savage austerity that some journalists and opponents of austerity like to use. Now, if you think that Greece's austerity is savage, well, that was 15% of GDP over 3 years. That's a lot, pretty severe, and so maybe strong language is warranted in talking about austerity in Greece. Then next is Portugal at 8%. That's still pretty hefty, but it's only half of what Greece was. Ireland, Romania, Spain, now we're down to 6%, Iceland, Lithuania, and then the US at 4%. So the US has been according to this data, 2/3 as austere as Spain and about half as austere as Portugal. And that does not match with the anti-austerity talking point that says the US is doing much better than Europe because we've had so much less austerity. In fact, the median cuts in the Eurozone in this data set were 3% of GDP over 3 years. And that's even less than the US, and it would be, the median, or the average would be lower if we weighted by country size. Germany, the largest economy in the Eurozone, has less than 1% of fiscal consolidation over 3 years. And that's despite enacting one of Europe's larger stimulus packages. And one of the things to note with austerity data, they bake in your temporary stimulus. So if you had a temporarily high stimulus in 2009 and that ends, that's going to get measured as a spending cut. So you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at those data. That's one of the reasons I like to look at the whole 2007 to 2012 period. A lot of today's discussion after me will focus on the composition of austerity, tax increases or spending cuts. And there's plenty of diversity there to work with. Belgium, Japan, and the Netherlands all increased taxes and increased spending. All of them grew more slowly than the US over the same time frame. Bulgaria, Canada, Germany, Hungary, Lithuania, Slovakia, and Sweden all cut taxes and cut spending at the same time. 5 of those 7 grew faster than the US, including Germany and Canada, which are pretty comparable economies. The IMF database shows up a lot of spending cuts, and those spending cuts are matched by the core government spending data. But if we take that same core government spending back 2 years to 2007, we observe that for countries that aren't in a major crisis, sort of your usual suspects in Southern Europe, the austerity cuts that happened after 2009 are smaller than the stimulus before 2009. Some people will argue that stimulus spending has expired too early, and that's fine, but that implicitly agrees that the stimulus should eventually expire. Now, on taxes, the story is a little darker. As I discussed earlier, it's hard to find those stimulus tax cuts in the data. But the austerity tax increases, they're right there in all the data sources. They're very easy to spot. In Greece's collapsing economy, citizens are paying a larger and larger share of their shrinking incomes in taxes. In France's stagnant but steady economy, the revenue rate has risen every year since 2007, and it's up to 54% of all income in 2012. And the final point I'm going to make is that the pattern of fiscal consolidations in the Eurozone can be explained most simply by structural deficits. Some analysts see market panic or irrationality in the rising interest rates that forced Portugal, Spain, Italy, and some others to attempt consolidation and seek assistance from the Euro institutions. But structural deficits in 2010 seem to explain the consolidation and the rising interest rates pretty well. So here's 3 charts. This is structural balance on a squared scale, interest rate spread, and the subsequent fiscal consolidation. The first 2 variables are measured in 2010. The others changes up to 2012 relative to a 2009 baseline. These match up almost perfectly. If you can distinguish a story in which you can tell that there's a stronger relationship between any 2 of these variables and the other 2, you've got sharper eyes than I. And so basically what it shows is that we really can't rule out anything from this. We can't rule out market panic or irrationality, but we also can't rule out that fiscal consolidations and the interest rate increases that forced them were based very closely on structural deficits, that structural deficits led to interest rate increases, and that those subsequently led to forced fiscal consolidation in the countries that had pretty large fiscal consolidation packages. Now, these neat relationships break down outside the Eurozone. Structural deficit remains, outside the Eurozone, it remains a good predictor of fiscal consolidation, but interest rate spreads no longer match up so closely. It's hard to know how to interpret that. It may merely reflect the fact that spreads, once you're outside of the currency union, are influenced a lot by expected currency movements, so that the fiscal part is outweighed by monetary worries. Or it could reflect the fact that a lot of what's measured as fiscal consolidation is really just temporary stimulus expiring. So you have those large structural deficits are occurring in countries that did big stimulus packages. Those are going away anyway, and that shows up as fiscal consolidation later And it might also reflect some damaging institutional features of the Eurozone. So in conclusion, just to wrap these points back up, generalizations about fiscal policy are not helping. Stimulus plans don't match up very well with the data, particularly on the tax side. Austerity has been very real in Greece, but tapers off pretty rapidly after that. The U.S. looks typical, not exceptional. And that was before, the U.S. fiscal consolidation numbers I mentioned, were all before the fiscal cliff tax increases and the sequester. And then last, fiscal consolidation appears to be at least as tightly related to structural deficits as it is to bond markets. So that's all I have for now. I'm really looking forward to our very distinguished speakers. So the first is Véronique de Rougy. So please welcome her. I've got to switch this off. All right. Anyway, this is supposed to go to a logo.
Am I sitting here?
So you just replace me.
All right.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to thank the Heritage Foundation, and especially Salim Firth for putting this event together. We cannot overstate how much energy and it took him to put this together and to this compendium that you have. I mean, it looks like nothing, but the guy had to herd a bunch of wildcat. How many of them were there? Like, you had to deal with 15 authors? Yeah, something like that. And he did it on schedule without having to yell too loud, I think. So, I think really need to, it's pretty remarkable. And also, I'm very grateful to be here with such a distinguished panel. Actually, I'm humbled because there's nothing that I will tell you, I came up with it myself. It's just like, I'm just going to report on the work of really these guys, because they are really the driving force behind the academic literature and the ideas and the things that we know on the issue of austerity. So I'm just reporting their phenomenal work. And that's for you too, Danielle. So I'm going to kind of take you and give you like a kind of an overview about what the academic literature says on the issue of austerity. And as it turns out, there's a lot of things that we know. There's a lot we don't know. I think there's still some debate, but this should be taken as kind of the state of our knowledge right now. For the first thing I'd like to stress out, which has been a source of frustration for me on working on this issue, is the fact that there's austerity and then there's austerity. Austerity is a word that a lot of people assign a definition which isn't necessarily what actually it means. What most economists mean when they talk about about austerity are fiscal adjustments that are meant to attempt to reduce the debt to GDP ratio. Well, that can be done in several ways. You can try to reduce the debt to GDP ratio by by cutting spending, by increasing taxes, or by doing a mix of both. However, this kind of fact is very often lost in the debate, and you've heard a lot of the time people use the word austerity as meaning spending cuts only, and describing what was going on in Europe as meaning, look, austerity has failed, meaning they've cut spending, when actually the details and the composition of these packages actually really mattered. So in the debate over austerities, there are two important questions in my mind, which are unfortunately, again, very often kind of put together. First is, what is the type of fiscal adjustment that actually successfully reduces the debt to GDP ratio? That's the first question. And the second question is, what is the impact of fiscal adjustment packages on economic growth, right? These are actually the two important questions. So what do successful fiscal adjustments look when you think about reducing the debt to GDP ratio? Well, the first thing we know, and this is what I'm going to talk to you about, is what we found doing a review of the literature, right? Is the type of, or the composition of these fiscal adjustment matter. Actually, whether they're made of spending cuts, tax increase, or a mix of both have an impact on whether these measures are successful. The second thing is like spending cuts rather than a mix of spending cuts and tax increases or tax increases alone are more successful to reduce the debt to GDP ratio than tax increases, are more successful. There's actually, Kevin Hassett and Professor Alessina Danieli, there has been a pretty wide consensus on this. The other thing that is important to look at is what kind of spending cuts? Is it any spending cuts? Is it stuff like sequestration, or what kind of cuts do you want to see? Which are the ones that are like more likely to reduce the debt to GDP ratio? There's an excellent paper by Kevin Hassett and Andrew Biggs and Matthew Jensen that actually looked among other things at this question, and they found reduction to social program, social transfer, and also payment to government employees, right? That's an important part of the kind of spending cuts that make fiscal adjustment successful to reduce the debt to GDP ratio. The other point that is also very important is, unfortunately, when you look at past fiscal adjustments, one of the things that you see is that most of them are failure. And they're failure because politicians rarely take the path of spending cuts. And they take very often a path that's heavily weighed towards tax increases. Now, there's the trickier question, because on what I just talked about, there's a fair consensus. There's people will argue about details but I think there's a pretty fair consensus. Now, the tricky question is the impact of fiscal adjustments on growth. I think there's a pretty good consensus when it comes to the impact of spending cuts on growth in the long term. And it's fairly positive. The real debate is about the impact of spending cuts or tax increases or tax cuts in the short term. But in spite of this, I think we see some area of consensus or agreement. And when I say agreement, take it with a grain of salt, as we'll see this morning, that are emerging. One of the things that we know, for instance, is in the search for stimulus, for expansion in growth, tax cuts are more stimulative than tax increases or spending increases. So that's one finding. The other one is that spending-based adjustments can be expansionary under some condition if you match them with good policy, with other good policy on the labor market side and things like this. It's unlikely that we will be seeing a lot of these benefits today, and I'm sure the rest of the panel will talk about this. But they are, it is, and when I say, it's possible. In fact, one of the things that was interesting, I was saying that I read last week, I read the macro book. It was the second edition, 2000, by David Romer, Professor David Romer, not known for being a raging libertarian, who's the husband of Christina Romer, who was the chair of the CAA. And he has an entire chapter on actually how spending cuts can be expansionary, citing the work of Professor Alessina, and Professor Pirati, and he explains why, and it's worth reading. So they can be. However, one of the consensus in the literature now is for the most part, spending cuts and tax increases are leading in the short term to not to economic growth. However, there's a significant difference about what's happening. So when you have spending cuts and they don't lead to short-term expansion, what you note is that the recession that follows, it's mild and short-lived. However, with tax increases, you are going to see a depressed economy at a much larger scale. Obviously, the devil's in the details. I mean, there's a lot of caveats, I'm sure, that we're going to be talking about. Now, these are like the main overall kind of lessons, right? And there's still a lot of things we don't know. And in particular, I mean, these are maybe too much generalization. I don't think so. I think there is quite a pattern that confirms, these academic findings that I just mentioned. That being said, one of the reasons why it is so hard to generalize all of this is because fiscal adjustments are, as we said, they can take many forms, and also they're multi-year packages. And the impact of each of its components, can ripple through for, many years to come. And also, they may not all be applied in 1 year, right? You could have several phases of fiscal adjustments. And in fact, it is often the case that they don't do just like fiscal adjustment 1 year and that's it. So it is really, I mean, it is a complex issue. But I think we've made a lot of progress. Now I want to actually talk to you about an interesting case study that I really looked into more deeply thanks to Salim, which is the case of France. I'm sure you cannot tell that I'm French by my accent. Not at all. But anyway, so the case of France is actually a really, really interesting case. French likes to think that they're really special, they're exceptional. I mean, I know Americans like to talk about the American exceptionalism, and the rah-rah-rah is nothing compared to how the French think about themselves. But in the case of austerity, it is really quite true. First, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that it is the only country that hasn't pretended that it was going to cut spending. I had to go back and read lots of journal articles, about a French newspaper, which is somewhat painful sometimes. And one of the things that's interesting is actually in the course of writing an op-ed with Professor Alessina about Italy, I also kind of try to read a lot about what was going on in Italy. And a lot of the reporting about Italy was Italy is going to adopt this fiscal adjustment package. It will be made of 30% spending cuts or $30 billion or euro spending cuts. You can't really find this in French newspaper in France. And in fact, when you actually look at what France has done, there's really actually three things that come out. First, they've done stimulus, like most countries. It was announced at the end of 2008. It was a package that was announced for 26 billion euros, right? That ended up being, and it was supposed to be spent over the course of 2 years, 2009 and 2010. It ended up being a cost of 47 billion euros. Obviously, I mean, it's nothing compared to what we spend in the US, but it's also a much smaller country. And then what you find, it's the second aspect. So in 2010, what they will call austerity is that actually really, they didn't actually jack up spending more than they were planning to. But as far as I can tell, even looking at the data, that's pretty much, all they've done in terms of spending austerity is just kind of like not continue growing spending as fast. In fact, spending on France has gone from, let's see, oh yeah, so sorry. So there was this fiscal stimulus, and then that was on top of all the rescues they did for the banks, and then there was also a 900 million euros stimulus to induce French people to buy cars, very important. And now the Hollande government, which is the first socialist government and has been elected and replacing François Sarkozy, is actually announced that it was going to do another round of stimulus, 20 billion and 12 billion. So lots of taxes. I think in your you can see there are a bunch of charts in the handout that you have that shows the path of spending. It's not really dramatic growth in spending, but it's spending. The thing that's also fairly clear is that whether it was under President Nicolas Sarkozy or President François Hollande, large amount of tax increases, like spectacularly large amount of tax increases. Some people have documented the tax increases, some watchdog in France under Sarkozy, and they've documented 205 different instances of tax increases. And some of them, is like the TV tax, a pretty significant increase in tobacco tax, sugar taxes, and things like this. But also an increase in the top marginal rate for income, a pretty sharp one, actually. And then François Hollande, of course, came in and doubled down. And what's interesting is that he's had less tax increases, and he's on path to have fewer tax increases than Sarkozy. However, his are really more bold. They're bold, right? I mean, you guys have all heard about, he campaigned and was elected on the idea of imposing a 75% marginal rate on income above 1 million euros, which is 1.3 million dollars. I hope, if you haven't, you should, seen the clip with Will Smith, who was on French TV, and he was talking about how, it's normal that rich people pay more, and he would be willing to, to be subjected to an increase in his top marginal rate, and the interviewer said 75%, and he literally was like, whoa! He was like, so anyway, Hollande campaigned on it. He was elected on this, which is crazy, and they passed it, and then it was shut down by the equivalent of, it's not the Supreme Court, it's like the equivalent of the Administrative Constitutional Court in France, and because they said it's unconstitutional. And Hollande said, okay. He went back to the drawing board, and he said, I know how to go around the objection, and now he's going to be implementing it, except it's going to be levied by the business, right? So just to give you a little, the other thing is, like, you've seen the charts, the revenue to GDP. France tax revenue has actually gone up, quite significantly, by 55 billion euros in the last 4 years, considering how the economy has been not doing well. It hasn't been growing. There are quarters where it was actually even shrinking, right? It's pretty powerful to manage to actually extract more revenue from people when their revenue is down. And half of that amount came from business taxes. The other thing that Hollande is planning on doing is increasing the VAT. The VAT has been fairly stable and flat overall since 2007, and now they're gonna jack it up for everything except they have several rates, but they're gonna jack it up except for one taxes. Taxes on labor obviously have been increased. Taxes on labor in France are significantly higher. They're about 50%, and the average, the OECD average is roughly 35%. So it's like France is already, has significantly higher taxes, where they've jacked that up. And since 2009, so in the last 4 years, there's been 84 different tax increases. And that's not counting the one that will take place in 2013 and that will take place and have been announced in 2014. The last and final point that I'd like to make about France is, if you remember the findings in Kevin Hassett's paper, is one of the things that you need, one of the kind of things that you need to see to have successful fiscal adjustment, and it is true for, it will ring true, I assume, here. It's you need to do fundamental structural reforms to your transfer programs. Well, France on net hasn't done any of this. Hollande was a very bad president. Lots of tax increases, not enough trimming the size of government. But one thing he had done very bravely was to increase the retirement age by 2 years, from 60 to 62. So 2 years. That led to weeks of unions and people and young people in the street demonstrating, and he did not cave. France is a tradition of taking the streets. There were strikes. People couldn't get in the subway. Even the Air France was on strike. It was crazy. He did not cave. He got his increase in retirement age. One teeny bitty step in the right direction. Well, Hollande came in power and reversed that decision. So on net, really nothing has happened. Now, Hollande is talking about taking on retirement reforms. They're so small that they're meaningless. But I have some hope, because I'm an eternal optimist. You have to be. If you're a French free market person, you have to be extremely optimistic to wake up in the morning. So, even when you live in the U.S. now, unfortunately. And one of the things is I've always assumed that we would see. I was hoping we would see a kind of a, Nixon goes to China type of thing. And I've always assumed that, a Democrat or a socialist, in the case of the French, could be the one to push entitlement reforms, right? Look, think about it. When the Republicans here talk about reforming entitlement, it means that they hate the poor, they hate, and I do think that if it comes from the left, or the so-called left, right, it's more. So I have some hope that maybe France will get its act together. The proposed reforms are meaningless. They're very teeny bitty. But just the fact that he's starting to engage, makes me think that maybe there is some hope that we'll see. The other thing is there's really no other way. It's not as if for all the critics of austerity as defined as spending cuts, right? The question is always, what is the alternative? What is the alternative? Should country keep on spending? Should country keep on taxing? Should country keep on borrowing the way they do? Do we really truly believe that this is going to lead to something good, right? They've managed to get away with it to some extent, but how long will that last? Do we have any alternative to austerity that is based on true entitlement reform and spending cuts? I don't think so, but thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very grateful.
Pull the microphone towards you.
Okay. Very grateful to the Heritage Foundation for inviting me here today. I hope you can all hear me okay. So, as Véronique mentioned, many advanced economies today are in fiscal consolidation mode. Budget deficits are being cut one way or another, and this is motivated by dealing with the legacy of the crisis, historically high budget deficits and government debt, and also the longer run aging pressures that are raising health spending and pension spending. And so it's a very prudent policy. Virtually all advanced economies are going to need and need fiscal consolidation. And there's a broad consensus that this has positive effects on the economy in the long run. And as Véronique also mentioned, there is, though, still some debate about what is the effect of fiscal consolidation, cutting spending, raising taxes in the short run. There's also a difference about the effects in normal times versus the kind of special conditions we've been having today, and people are actively debating that. And they're also debating what is the right speed of consolidation. Should you front-load it, get it over with in the short run, or should you spread it over a longer run? So I'm going to talk about these issues, drawing mainly on the research we've been doing at the IMF. As they mentioned, I work at the IMF in the research department. So let's get started. I'll first talk about this debate about the short-run effects of fiscal consolidation on the economy. And the debate here is really not only about the size of multipliers. That's the multipliers, as you may know, the effect on GDP for a given change in taxes or spending. There's still some debate about even the sign. This was particularly an active debate before the crisis, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about this debate, how it's evolved. And as you know, a standard implication of textbook Keynesian models is that you raise taxes, you cut spending. In the short run, this has a negative effect on the economy. But actually, there's an alternative view, and David Romer's textbook is a good place to read up about it. This is the sort of expansionary fiscal contractions view, and there was a lot of belief in that. And here's a quote from a former president of the European Central Bank, Jean-Claude Trichet, who said it's an error to think that fiscal austerity is a threat to growth. You see that there's possibly gain without pain, even in the short run. This is the idea. And so let's talk a bit about this idea. It has a very firm theoretical basis. My own boss, Olivier Blanchard, who's the chief economist of the IMF, in the early 90s, he wrote down a model in which if you raise taxes permanently, this will have, on the one hand, the standard negative effects on spending, but also by reassuring people that there's no crisis, no need to have a more abrupt adjustment later on because you've started cutting your deficit, that this can actually unleash optimism and confidence and overturn the standard Keynesian negative effects and actually lead to an expansion even in the short run. This expansionary fiscal contractions view was then, people found evidence for that. And there's path-breaking work here. I've listed some of them, those of you who couldn't see it. Francesco Giavazzi and Marco Pagano in the early 90s, Alberto Alesina, Silvia Ardagna, Roberto Perotti, all of these people, and by the way, they were not all Italian. They found some very striking results. I'm going to read you some of the quotes from this literature. Many fiscal contractions have been associated with higher growth, even in the very short run. More often than not, spending cuts boost growth. And to be fair, I'm sure that in a number of the episodes that this literature highlights, these confidence effects based on the theory were playing a role. I want to move on, though, to discuss the recent research where there's been a bit of a reassessment. There's been some research done in recent years that kind of is concerned by the idea that the way that these studies typically measure fiscal adjustment, and as Salim mentioned, it's really there are different ways of measuring fiscal adjustment. The way that these studies typically measure adjustment may be nudging the data towards finding evidence of expansionary effects in the short run and away from finding evidence of contractionary effects. So this is this needs a little bit of explanation. So let me just bear with me. If you want to look at the effect of a policy on growth in the short run, ideally you'd have an experiment. You have policymaking making a random decision to raise taxes or to cut spending. Obviously that doesn't happen in the real world, but you do need to go beyond just looking at a cut in the budget deficit. The budget deficit can fall just because the economy is taking off. And so then if you conclude that, well, the budget deficit came down, that boosted growth, you're getting it wrong, right? So obviously the literature that I'm talking about doesn't do that. They do a neat and simple method. They adjust changes in the budget balance for the business cycle, typically by relating it to the change in the unemployment rate and taking that part out. So this is what you call the cyclically adjusted primary balance. And the change in that is what you use to change in that is supposed to reflect then things not related to the business cycle, and you can use that to study the effect on growth. And you can do this on the spending side as well, cyclically adjusted spending, cyclically adjusted revenue. The problem is that even once you do this cyclical adjustment, you're still left with a lot of things that are related to the short-run outlook. And many of them have nothing to do with policy. For example, in the years before the crisis in Ireland, there was a big housing boom. Capital gains taxes went up. This really flattered the fiscal accounts, and it looked like, taxes, if based on this measure, you would look at this as a tax hike. And you'd say, well, during good times, they were raising taxes. You'd be biasing yourself towards saying that tax hikes were not as contractionary for growth. In the crisis, asset prices collapsed. Looks like a tax cut using this measure. You're going to associate tax cut with a recession. It's biasing yourself away from the standard kind of sign of multipliers. Other factors creep into these CAPB measures, like accounting operations. Again, nothing to do with policy. That creates noise and obscures the real relationship. But of course, they also have policy changes reflecting in the CAPB. Problem, some policy changes are a response to the economy. When there's a recession, governments cut taxes, raise spending. When there's a boom, and this is annual data, within the year, you sometimes have governments actually cooling the economy by cutting spending, raising taxes. So there again, you're going to be associated yourself with the cycle, and that's not what you want. So what did we do? In a work that started as a WEO chapter, the World Economic Outlook, back in 2010, we called it Will It Hurt? And we've gone on to extend this analysis. It's coming out in the Journal of the European Economic Association now. What we did was the Romer and Romer narrative approach. So we said we want to find actual decisions that policymakers did. We look in the we open the history books, the budgets, the policy documents from way back when. We found for 17 OECD countries decisions to change taxes or spending that were not a reaction to the short-run outlook. So not stimulus, not cooling the economy. And we focused on long-run motivation, long-run financial health of the government, raising taxes for prudent. The OBRA, the Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 1993 is a good example. Here in the US, raise taxes, cut spending, prudent policy for long-run reasons, not because the economy was overheating or doing some business cycle tuning, okay? We're doing that. Technically, we're creating an instrument for the CAPB. Now, how do those two measures stack up? You look at the CAPB, those of you see this chart. On the vertical axis, you've got the change in the CAPB. On the horizontal, you've got the narrative policy changes that we have identified. And you can see that there's a good relation between them. They correlated, which is what you want. You want to capture something that's going to have an effect on the fiscal balance. But there are some big, big differences. And what we argue is that when you have a big difference between these two measures, you're better off going with the narrative approach. Let me give you a few examples. And I've highlighted the really big differences here with labels. Take Germany in 1996. It looks like, according to the CAPB, the Germans in 1996 cut the budget deficit by more than 6% of GDP. This is really terrific consolidation in 1 year. It's more than what Greece has been doing in some of the recent years. Turns out that was actually an accounting operation. They wrote the East German housing debt from one book into the other. It made the budget deficit shoot up in 1995. Well, the next year it came down. It wasn't a gigantic consolidation, but it occurred, and that's going to create the kind of noise I was talking about. Another example, Ireland in 2009. Again, they had a terrible recession that showed up as an easing in the cyclically adjusted primary balance. Looks like a stimulus. Actually, no, they were doing substantial fiscal consolidation, almost 5% of GDP of cuts in the budget deficit deliberately. You can see also other examples in the paper. It's a more reliable measure of policy, and what's more, it's less correlated with news that's coming in about the state of the economy, and that's what this whole thing is about, getting things that are less related to the short-run business cycle. So with that in hand, we now go and look at the effects of fiscal consolidation, and we're going to compare the two approaches again. Using the conventional approach, if you relate this to private consumption and to GDP, you find, using the conventional approach, that actually on average, 2 years after a 1% of GDP budget deficit cut, based on the CAPB, you've got an expansionary effect. So this is exactly in line with the idea of households getting confident. This is going to confirm that idea, and GDP also is going up. So expansionary effect. But if you use this narrative approach, you get exactly the opposite. You get significant contraction. So you see, even on average, there's an expansion based on the conventional approach. And so, of course, there are many cases you can find where this was gain without pain. But we find a multiplier actually on average of about 0.8. So that's what we find. But then we look at the question that's on a lot of people's minds: what is the difference between cutting spending and raising taxes? So what did we find on that? Veronique already alluded to that. What we find is that when you split adjustment packages into those that really relied on spending cuts, and by the way, those were about 2/3 of the sample that we found, and those that relied mainly on tax increases, you find that after tax increases and spending cuts, the economy suffered in the short run, but that spending cuts were followed by a much smaller contraction. Although it wasn't that small, right? We're talking here about 1% of GDP consolidation, and you can see spending is going down quite a bit. The question is really why, and I think that's where we really need to make more progress, because there are a number of reasons this could be happening. One of them that we argue for in the paper, and what we find is that there's a significant difference in monetary policy between these two types of packages. After spending-based packages, the central bank typically cuts the policy interest rate by about 1.7 percentage points more. So that can already go some way towards explaining the difference. If you're getting more, some people call it monetary morphine, then of course the consolidation is less painful, right? But that surely cannot explain the whole difference. And another explanation, also one that Alberto has explored with his co-authors, is the idea of confidence. Confidence being boosted when you cut spending. I think it's fair to say that with annual data that we have, you cannot really reach a conclusion, because you don't know if confidence went down first and output therefore suffered, or if the reason confidence went down more after tax increases is that first output fell and that made everybody more gloomy. So it's hard to distinguish cause and effect. But we need to do more research, and there's exciting work going on, including that Alberto is doing, so I'm sure we'll get closer to the truth. In the meantime, though, I think it's fair to say that the jury is still out on this, And in fact, there are many studies that find it the opposite, and they're claiming that spending has a bigger effect on the economy than taxes in the short run. So that was all about history, and I think it's fair to say that we're kind of moving beyond this debate. I think there's now a wider acknowledgement that the evidence of expansionary effects in the short run, that there's less evidence of that than we used to think, and that fiscal consolidations do have short-run negative effects. But then the question is, what about in today's special environment? Because all of that evidence was based on the history of the last 30 years in advanced countries when the monetary morphine was available. Central banks could cut interest rates. Today, with interest rates at zero, they can't do that. Plus, other things are making multipliers bigger. Banks are not in good health in a number of economies. That makes it harder for businesses to borrow. So firms spend more out of current profits than from future profits. Households spend more from their current income than from their future income. All of this makes shocks, including those coming from the government, have a bigger effect on the economy. And also there's a number of studies that show that when there's a great deal of slack in the economy, that's when fiscal policy has a particularly pronounced effect. So you might think that going into this crisis, people may have been surprised at how big multipliers are. And we tried to look into that with Olivier Blanchard. We wrote a paper that looks at surprises in growth and fiscal consolidation. And what we found, what we asked is, have multipliers been larger than expected since the beginning of the crisis? And our focus was on European economies in early 2010. The forecasts made for these economies, a lot of them launched fiscal consolidation packages at that time. It was an important year. The conditions for abnormally large multipliers were ripe. That's why we focused on this sample. And we found that, on average, there was a tendency for those countries that had planned more fiscal consolidation to have more disappointing growth. Now, that should not happen. If the multipliers that people were assuming were the right ones, then disappointments should be up and down, but not related to how much adjustment you've got planned. It should be noise, right? But there was a very systematic relation. And the interpretation we offer is that, forecasters implicitly underestimated fiscal multipliers by, and it turns out that the coefficient means by about 1. So if they assumed a multiplier on average of 0.5, it would have been more like 1.5. The interesting thing in terms of our discussion is that we found very similar results for multiplier underestimation on the spending side as on the tax side. So the ones that were cutting spending were getting as big a negative surprise as those that were raising taxes in terms of multipliers being bigger than expected. And we did a lot of other work in this analysis. I just wanted to give you a flavor here. The implications for actual multipliers are obviously one stage removed because we're looking at forecast errors about multipliers, how wrong were the multipliers, if you like. So to know what that implies for actual multipliers, you need to know what was in the mind of the forecasters, and that's not easy because it's often done implicitly. But we think that, at least at the fund, and these are the forecasts we focused on, about 0.5. So people were not expecting expansionary contraction in the short run, but about 0.5. So that would mean roughly that at least early in the crisis, they were, true multipliers may have been well above 1. But what we also found, and we did this because there was a lot of commentary on our work, we then looked at every forecast made from 2009 through 2012, and we found that this pattern of underestimating multipliers has really come down in recent years. And there are two reasons that can be. One, and we think this is probably what's going on, given what's going on in the building, people are adjusting the way they make these forecasts, and they're learning from what's going on about the effects of consolidation. Another interpretation is that as the severity of the crisis has eased from 2009, 2010 through more recent years, multipliers also have gradually come down. But there's a very big health warning, and Salim also alluded to this. There's no one multiplier for all countries at all times. Things depend on time and on the type of instrument. And what the multipliers are only one of the ingredients you need to decide what the right pace of consolidation, how much to do now, how much to do later. And I just want to say a few more words about that to end. So as I said, fiscal multipliers are only one thing you need to decide on the right pace. So again, with Olivier, we did an article that sort of gives you the other ingredients. So the next other ingredient is, well, how weak is your economy to start off with? Because when your growth is, let's say, 1%, you do fiscal consolidation, you're at greater risk of getting into a recession than when you start from a more healthy economy, let's say growing at 3. This has to do with all the non-linearities that take off in a recession, bank non-performing loans and other things. It's dangerous to get into a recession. So you want to bear in mind the stall speed, right? That's a danger zone. Another one is the danger when a weak economy of inflicting long-run damage, because when unemployment is high and a lot of people have been unemployed for a long time, that's when they're particularly vulnerable. If you then raise the unemployment even further by slamming on the fiscal brakes, and you raise the unemployment rate from, say, 9 to 10, that can do a lot more long-run damage than raising it from, say, 4 to 5, because of the impact on long-run unemployment and the loss of skills and all of that. But, of course, as we say, there are also reasons to do more now and less later, and those have to do with reasons that go beyond the usual textbook reasons to do fiscal consolidation. They have to do with what people call debt overhang, the idea that when investors, financial investors, get nervous about the government being able to pay its bills, they then also charge the private sector higher rates. And this creates a lot of uncertainty as well, and all of that depresses investment. So that's one reason to do more now. Another one has to do with what people call multiple equilibria. This is just the idea that when you've got a very high debt to GDP ratio, there are two equilibria that are sort of self-fulfilling. One situation is where investors believe that you'll still pay your debt, so they charge you a low interest rate, and so you can relatively comfortably keep paying your bills. The other one is where they see the high debt, they start getting nervous, they charge you a higher interest rate, then the government finds it harder to actually pay, and this sort of self-fulfilling spiral takes off. And that's the bad equilibrium. Now, in principle, the central bank, and this is particularly the case in countries that have their own currency, the central bank can step in and rule out that bad equilibrium, buy government debt, keep rates down. There are limits to how much central banks can do on that. It's very difficult to know what the right interest rate is at which to intervene, and there are other problems. So the good news is that investors don't care about just the debt to GDP ratio, some magic threshold. They care more about just the credibility of the government, and that can be enhanced in a number of ways. One is having a medium-term plan with legislated measures to rein in entitlement spending, for example, over a long period. Fiscal rules. You can establish credibility. The question here is whether front-loading and doing more today is another way of getting credibility. And a lot of countries have done a lot of fiscal adjustment up front these days. The problem is that the evidence is actually mixed. Sometimes if you ram on the fiscal brakes too hard in the short run, it can have perverse effects. And there are studies that show that investors don't just care about how much the deficit is falling, they also care about the growth rate of your economy. And so if you you cut the deficit, but then growth falls, at some point the balance can tip so far that they actually punish you for having cut your budget deficit. And the debt to GDP ratio can actually go up, incidentally, as well as a result of this. So, but that doesn't necessarily carry the day, this argument, because it's hard to tie the hands of future governments, so putting it off indefinitely is not the way either. Bottom line. So what we say is the need for medium-term comprehensive fiscal consolidation plans that phase in entitlement reform and things like that, and don't require severe adjustment like we've had in some countries recently, even this year. Structural targets so that you don't have to offset a fall in revenue because of the recession with further cuts. You keep your eye on the medium run. And also to adjust pace according to demand. But obviously all of this depends on you having the luxury of choice. Some countries do not have that flexibility. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Great job, Daniel. It's really, as Veronique mentioned, an incredible honor to be on a panel with really the two people who've been the leaders in this literature. Alberto, you started a literature. I'm sure it's a contribution that comes up in Nobel conversations. If your conclusions were a little less conservative, you'd be a shoo-in. But I think that if you look at the astonishing accomplishment of the work of the IMF team going back over the last few years, that it wouldn't have happened if Alberto hadn't started this literature really a long time ago. Veronique mentioned with excessive praise my own incredibly paltry contributions in this space, which really just amounted to the following, that Vince Reinhardt was at AEI until recently, and his wife Carmen and Ken Rogoff have done all this work on what happens to countries after a financial crisis, if you read the Reinhardt-Rogoff work, then you can see that you can expect to have a period of really terrible growth for about a decade after a financial crisis if you're a typical country, and I looking at that work, which was incredibly timely, sadly, that you could see that there are a number of reasons why I don't like to just look at the data and say, well, the data say it's going to be bad, and then believe it's true until you understand, well, why is it going to stink? And in the history of financial crises, there are a number of things that jump out at you. There are really 4 or 5. I don't need to list them all here. But the biggest one, the number one is that if you have a financial crisis in your country, then debt to GDP doubles. That's it. That's what happens. If you were 0.6, you're 1.2. If you're 0.4, you're 0.8. Something about doubles. It's a regular feature. It's what happened to us. And so then when your debt to GDP about doubles, well, then, the IMF's interested in you. And we've got to decide, well, what are we going to do? And so then what happens very often is that there's this period, I think, looking again at the anecdotal history, where investors and individuals and countries are very anxious about, well, we've got this massive deficit, a debt that's become unsustainable. What are they going to do about it? And in that period where they don't know what they're going to do about it, then a lot of bad things can happen. Growth can be really, really low. But then the features of the measures taken to reduce the debt can have a big effect on the economy too. And so why did I wade into this literature and start bugging Alberto for his data a few years ago and so on, is that I knew that both members of both parties were going to be faced with the question of fiscal consolidation in the U.S. And I wanted to try to look at the data and decide when inevitably they asked me to testify, which they did, what I was going to say. And that's the only reason I waited. And so again, I never took any of my work and sent it to an academic journal because it's not nearly as important as what you guys are doing. But I think that as a consumer of your work, here's what I think I learned. First of all, that the early work showing expansionary effects of fiscal consolidation, that there's still some dispute about whether it can happen or not. It seems I agree with the IMF authors, Daniel and the others, that it's probably a much smaller effect than we used to think. And if you do see the effect at all anymore, it's only if there's a fiscal consolidation that's really focused on entitlements. And so I'm not surprised at all by the excellent recent work by you and Olivier on the forecast errors and stuff like that, because most of the decisions that people made didn't actually go after the one thing, entitlements, where you might have expected to see something that wasn't so bad. And so I think that's the first thing that I think I know. The second thing I think I know is that there's this accounting identity that we learn in introductory macroeconomics, that the GDP is C plus I plus G plus the stuff that other countries have to worry about. U.S. has usually been autarkic, but the G is in there, and it seems like there's kind of G denial in a lot of corners of Washington and the intellectual debate. The idea that if you take government spending and cut it a lot this year, well, that's going to be something that's has a negative effect on Y unless there's a lot of other stuff changing. So that's another thing that we know from the literature, is that there's an accounting identity and you can't ignore it. The last thing that we know, and this is kind of like we're listing liabilities, here's an asset, is that there's another irregularity in the literature, which is that if you have a really big government as a share of GDP, then your long-run growth is going to be lower. And guesstimating it's hard to do this from VARs and so on, but it looks like about 10% of GDP means that your long run of bigger government means that your long run growth rate is going to be about 0.5% lower, maybe 1%, somewhere in there. So if you have a smaller government, then it's good for growth. And I think that literature is probably pretty believable too, because you're not going to get a lot of total factor productivity growth out of the government, I'm guessing. And so if we've got a bigger private sector, then there's more hope that we could get luck into some cool technological change that would drive growth a little higher. And also you bid up wages. There's big literature on this. If you have a big government sector, and it makes it harder for the private sector to grow. Okay, so we know all that, and so then we're faced with a fiscal consolidation situation. Then our problem then is to try to construct something that will reduce debt to GDP. And do so without causing economic growth to go even lower, because we know that we just had a financial crisis, and so we're going to be growing about 1% a year less than we expected. We're starting off from a low level. It's very easy to toss us back into a recession. So what do we do? And I think that looking at the work that you guys have done, that a policy jumps out that was the focus of my testimony at the first stimulus hearing at the House Budget Committee, right as the Obama administration was beginning. And I think that the interesting thing about all the work that's been going on is that policy that jumped out from this literature, which was still really evolving back then, in 2008 and 2009, is still, I think, what we would all agree we ought to do right now. And since our heritage is meant to lead policy, I think that it's useful to point that out now and then put it on the table for future discussion so we can think about what that means. So I think that a fiscal consolidation isn't necessarily going to give us growth, and so we can't think that we've got weak growth, and so therefore let's just have a fiscal consolidation and ignore the near-term growth effects, because there's no way we'll have a recession. There's not going to be a celebration. That you can get that effect if you sort of focus extremely on entitlements. That there's a little bit in your paper. There was that one impulse response chart where you can see positive growth effects for the fiscal consolidation if they're heavily laden with entitlements. We know that fiscal consolidations that are heavily tax-based have not typically been successful as well. And I think that we understand why that is basically because if you think part of the problem is that governments like to spend and they tend to spend irresponsibly, then the sign that their approach to a near-term debt crisis is to increase taxes is a sign that they're not really serious about going after the thing that's causing the problem in the first place. And so it's like sample selection bias or something, but if they're the tax increase guys are the guys who aren't serious. And so what we have to do is think about, well, why is it that we might get a successful consolidation? And in our paper, we looked at using the IMF list at all the ones that failed and succeeded, and then thought about, well, we in the U.S. want to model ourselves after that one. So why is it that some succeed? And I think that the answer is that there are two effects that can be offsetting. One is if everybody thinks the world's going to end, it's just going to be a disaster, that the sky is going to fall. And then all of a sudden you give them a reason to believe that that's not going to be true, then you can get a positive expectational effect. If you cut, say, government spending a lot or increase taxes a lot this year, then that's going to give you a negative impulse, as we discussed. And so the problem then becomes, as a policy designer, to think about something that can give you a big enough expectational effect so that you can overwhelm whatever near-term effects that you cause by changing your policy. Now, in some sense, that's bad news for the U.S., and the reason why we have to be cautious about using the data that Alberto was really the first to start to analyze, because in a lot of these countries that are having debt crises, I mean, there's a serious, serious chance that country's going to default on its debt, and it's just going to be, Armageddon. And I think that the U.S. being the kind of place where everybody wants to park their money and the reserve currency and all that means that the negative expectations, the oppressive effects of negative expectations on U.S. growth can't nearly be what they would be for like a banana republic in distress. And so if we clean house, then the expectational effect can't possibly be as big as some of the things you see in the data. So that's a problem. And so what could we do? What would a policy look like that would solve all of these problems and be guided on this sort of consensus in the literature, the stuff that the IMF and Alberto agree on? Well, here is my proposal in that House Budget Committee hearing back then. And I still think it's the right answer for what we should do now. And it would take a form like this. It doesn't have to be exactly this. Suppose that we change the indexing formula in the US for Social Security from wages to prices. In present value, that reduces the long-run deficit by maybe, I haven't done the calculation in a few years now, but probably it's something like $7 trillion net improvement in the budget situation. And you're cutting benefits of people off in the future. It's not 100% of our problem, but it's a big step in the right direction to all of a sudden improve the present value of the fiscal balance for the U.S. by $7 trillion. It probably wouldn't create, that alone wouldn't create much near-term disruption at all. The reason is that if you take a poll of college students, more believe in extraterrestrials than that they're going to get Social Security. And so if we cut their Social Security off in the future, they're not going to reduce their consumption today very much. We don't really have to worry about that. But you could expect markets to be pleased that the U.S. has finally gone after a big thing and done something. And so it could be you could stop there. You could just make that one change, call that a fiscal consolidation, and you could conceivably get a positive growth effect out of that. But what I proposed back then, especially because we were in a recession, was that we probably shouldn't count on the positive effect of that being so big that we could actually call it a stimulus. And we just bought $7 trillion, so let's use some of the money to do something that would actually create a near-term stimulus, but do so in a sustainable way that wouldn't give us a hangover a year later. And so my proposal back then was to use about $1 trillion of the money to reduce the corporate rate by about 10 percentage points over the next decade, but to phase it in, to start at 35 and then go to 33 and 31 and 29 and 27. And the reason you do that is that if the corporate tax rate is declining, then it's like having an investment tax credit because you get your deduction at the high rate, but you get your income tomorrow at a lower rate. And it has a pretty positive stimulative effect on investment spending to try to get your capital purchases in while you can still deduct it at the higher rate. And so it's really, a nice focused way to increase growth today and put people's desired capital stocks at a higher level so that they'll be ramping to a place that they'll be willing to stay. You won't have a hangover in the end. Now, I'd put it to you that if we had done this in 2009, just that we'd be in a lot better shape today, that we'd probably be growing a lot more and would have created a lot more jobs. My view, and I'll stop here, and I know we're going to take a break then, and then we're going to turn over to really the pioneer of this literature, Alberto, and then have a general conversation. My view is that if you look at all the dispute in the literature, the consensus of the literature is that what I just said is a good policy idea. That's like the sweet spot of what all this stuff implies, and I think that's not a liberal thing or a conservative thing. It's a data thing, and we in the U.S. still have a fiscal consolidation problem, and so some policy that has features like those I just discussed is essential for us to adopt. And I look forward to discussion with the audience and the panel about that after the break. And do you want to speak a little bit before the break, or shall I just announce? So everybody has 5 minutes now to stretch their legs, and we'll see you. We'll see you in 5 minutes. Thank you.
So I know we have more guests filing back in, but I'm just gonna begin introducing Professor Alberto Alsina. He's our keynote speaker today, and we're really honored to have him at the Heritage Foundation. As everybody has alluded to, Professor Alsina is really the intellectual bedrock and continues to be a key intellectual contributor to the debate on fiscal adjustments. Alberto Alsina is the Nathaniel Ropes Professor of Political Economy at Harvard University, where he served as chairman of the Department of Economics from 2003 to 2006. He was born... Unfortunately. He was born in Italy and earned his PhD at Harvard in 1986. He's published extensively on empirical and theoretical topics as wide-ranging as political business cycles, redistributive policy, and the role of gender in economic growth. His most recent books are The Future of Europe, Reform or Decline, and Fighting Poverty in the U.S. and Europe, A World of Difference. He has served the economics profession as co-editor of the prestigious Quarterly Journal of Economics and as a member of the Econometric Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the National Bureau of Economic Research. He has held visiting positions at Bocconi University, MIT, the World Bank, the IMF, among other institutions. He's among the world's leading scholars on fiscal adjustments, publishing peer-reviewed articles and writing working papers on the topic. Among his best-known works in the field, and this is really a small sample of his very extensive writing, among his best-known works are Why Are Stabilizations Delayed, which was in the American Economic Review in 1991, co-authored with Alan Drazen. Fiscal Expansions and Adjustments in OECD Economies, 95, with Roberto Perotti. Large Changes in Fiscal Policy, Taxes versus Spending, 2010, with Silvia Ardagna. And The Output Effect of Fiscal Consolidations, 2012, with Favero and Giovezzi. In 2013, he co-edited the NBER volume, Fiscal Policy After the Financial Crisis. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Alberto Alesina.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and great honor to be here with you, and thank you all for organizing this event. What I'm going to do is to review what I think we agree upon, what I think we know about fiscal adjustment. I will repeat some of the same things that Daniel had said with perhaps slightly different emphasis, and then present some new result from this paper that Salim mentioned with Favero and Giovezzi on the output cost of fiscal consolidation. I think we all agree that countries have to do some form of fiscal consolidation. We had some discussion about how fast and how quickly, as Daniel pointed out, the long run we need to do it. So I will focus on one specific issue, which is the short run, so that the composition, tax versus spending, and the short run cost, under the assumption that I think we all agree that in the long run fiscal consolidation is needed, so there's not much to debate here. So let me see. I think that there is a lot of agreement on a few things, or at least that's my reading of the literature. Expenditure-based adjustments are much less costly in terms of output losses than tax-based one, and we saw even in the chart by Daniel that there are tax-based adjustments seem to be 4 times more costly than spending-based adjustment. And this, on the second point, there may be less agreement, but I will show you some results later. Expenditure-based adjustment in some cases show no cost in terms of output losses, and sometimes the economy recovered very quickly above the starting point, and this I would refer to as expansionary fiscal adjustment. Expenditure-based adjustment reduce the debt over GDP ratio much more quickly than tax-based ones. The difference between tax-based and spending-based cannot be explained by different monetary policy accompanying the 2 types of adjustment. As I will show you some results later, there is some difference, but it cannot explain even a fraction of it. Monetary policy is indeed a bit looser with expenditure-based adjustment probably because tax-based ones are more inflationary, particularly if they happen with indirect tax increases and the monetary policy react. The above results do not mean that spending multiplier are 0 or negative. They certainly are positive. We can debate how big they are, but they are certainly positive. They certainly are positive. I think the evidence suggests that they're much smaller than tax multiplier. But when we talk about fiscal consolidation that may have non-Keynesian effect, is because of the package that goes with spending-based fiscal adjustment. A fiscal adjustment typically is a multi-year thing with many things happening at the same time. So when Roberto Perotti and Silvia Ardagna and I were writing about the possibly expansionary fiscal adjustment, we were not saying that the spending cuts are negative. We were saying that it is possible to do spending cuts accompanying with some policy reform that may eliminate the negative Keynesian effect of spending cuts because we have supply side reforms that may help. And in fact, we have, in the paper that Salim nicely mentioned, we have several narratives of case studies in which these packages did indeed work, namely packages of spending cuts and various accompanying policies that have eliminated the cost of fiscal adjustment. The other result that comes out of the evidence is that as Cami mentioned, there is, we know that y is equal to c plus g plus i. So if g goes down, something else has to go up, either c or I or export. And what we find is in various papers is that most economies are focused on consumption, but in fact, what indeed seem to react positively to spending cut is actually private investment. And that may have to do with confidence, in fact, the fact that tax-based adjustment may, because of tax increases, may hurt investment, may have distortionary effect. And as Daniel pointed out, there is still a lot of work to figure it out. But the evidence suggests that if there is a component of aggregate demand that helps a lot, our investment, and in the case of a small open economy, export have also helped because with tax increases that has hurt competitiveness, and competitiveness is not hurt if you cut spending. In fact, it may help because if part of the spending cut is, say, reduction in government employment, that may have effect on wages even in the private sector. So I think this is my reading of the evidence of what we know about fiscal adjustment based on the pre-crisis effect, namely everything we knew until the latest round of adjustment after the fiscal crisis, the financial crisis. Now, the financial crisis has opened a new round of adjustment. As Daniel said, that may be a particularly difficult situation for two reasons. One, which is very well known, the zero lower bound. The other reason, which is, I think Daniel alluded to, but is worth emphasizing, many European countries, particularly the southern European countries, face a big credit crunch. Their banks are not in order for a variety of reasons, which we won't go into here. So the European economies are suffering for that too. So I think in 5 or 10 years, when we will write the history of this period, I'm sure there will be papers written in 5 years that will show that, say, the recession in Italy or Spain is caused in part by the fiscal adjustment, but in large part also by the credit crunch. A different way of putting it is that the U.S. did it right. They sort of fixed the banks one way or the other, and then they are doing some fiscal consolidation. Europe is doing it probably with the wrong timing, doing the fiscal consolidation with their banks not in order. The second, more well-known argument is that a zero lower bound monetary policy can help less the fiscal adjustment. So that is an implication that may make fiscal adjustment, being those on the spending side or on the tax side, more costly at the zero lower bound. This is probably right. But I think in our work we find no evidence that the difference between tax-based and spending-based is affected by monetary policy, and therefore at zero lower bound, both spending-based and tax-based fiscal adjustment may be more costly, but we find no evidence that the difference between the two is affected by being at zero lower bound or not. So it is perfectly possible that in this situation of credit, in fact it is very likely that in this situation of credit crunch and zero lower bound, fiscal adjustment may be more costly than they used to be in normal times, but we find no evidence that the difference between the two is affected. So the punchline, I think that the word austerity should be prohibited by law, because I think I think if by austerity we mean the reduction of deficit, is a very misleading thing. There are tax increases and spending cuts have very different effect on the economy, and talking about austerity is misleading, because and I will expand on that, the difference between the two is so different that is putting together really apple and oranges. So okay, so these are what my view about what I think I know, and let me now go a little bit more in detail about where I think this evidence come from, and Daniel has already somehow summarized this literature, so I apologize, I will be repeating some of the things that he said, but it's useful. So since the early 90s up until 2010, I think there were dozens of papers written with the methodology that Daniel mentioned, that looking at the cyclically adjusted primary deficit and looking at cases in which the cyclically adjusted primary deficit fell in a number of years by a lot in a period. And the argument was, well, if this cyclical adjustment primary deficit fell by so much, if there is smoke, there is roast, so something must have been going on because these policymakers were trying to do something. And the idea that such large changes could not be only the result of the cycle, and there has to be something going on in terms of discretionary policy. Based on this identification assumption, certainly imperfect, we got the result that Daniel summarized, namely that there were several cases in which spending-based fiscal adjustment were accompanied by, even in the short run, with no cost or possibly increasing growth. And as the narrative goes, but that was the case when accompanied by other supply-side reform that helped growth. The WIO of September 2010 came out with a really violent criticism of this approach and suggested a methodology by Romer and Romer, namely applied to these 17 countries, in which they were identifying exogenous changes to fiscal policy based on the intention of policymakers to say, we want to cut spending or increase taxes because we need to reduce the deficit. This has nothing to do with how the economy is going, but it has to do with our desire to reduce the deficit, and therefore these exogenous to the economy. I mean, this narrative approach is good. Then you have to be very careful about how to do it. I think it was well done. I've now done a lot of work on it, and there are some minor issues that can be addressed, but pretty much the narrative approach is very convincing. Now, one caveat. Daniel used Ireland 2009 as an example of a major deviation between the two methodologies. Ireland 2009 is not in the sample of the paper by Silvia and myself in 2010, so that crazy event of Ireland would not affect our result. I don't remember about Germany, but since it was right after the unification, I'm sure we worried about the unification of Germany. I don't remember what we did, but certainly Ireland 2009 is not in our sample. Now, we took that work very seriously. In a paper also with Silvia and Dania, we used both the old approach and the new approach in a very simple way, looking at what happened after tax-based and spending-based fiscal adjustment. And in fact, we found that the result on the two, just by looking at the data, we are much more similar than you would sort of see, or at least that you would gather by reading the WIO 2010. I mean, again, spending-based were much less costly than tax-based adjustment, and in some cases, spending-based adjustment were followed by, they had no cost, and once again, because they were those accompanied by a package of appropriate policies. So that paper was simply descriptive. We simply look at the IMF episode, and again, the results were yes, a little weaker in terms of the presence of expansionary fiscal adjustment, but the results were not so different of saying that this is a completely different world. I mean, as Daniel pointed out, the correlation between the two shocks is positive, and we can there are clearly some big deviations that one can leave out, but just looking at the data, the results were not as enormously different as one might think. But now let me turn, oops. Uh-oh. For some reason, I don't have the slide with some picture that come. I will tell them what to do. I don't have the slide with some picture that come from this paper with Favero and Giavazzi. So let me describe to you those pictures. This paper with Favero and Giavazzi, we took the IMF their data, the IMF data, and we essentially did what we think is a step forward. They look at fiscal spending shock and tax shocks in a year-by-year with a year-by-year methodology. So every year that there is a spending cut or a tax increases, they code it as a spending cut, tax increase in that year. We look at fiscal plans. That is typically, and we base that on their own research. Government announce a multi-year fiscal plan. They say in year T we'll do this, in year T plus 1 we'll do that, in year T plus 2 we'll do that, in year T plus 3 we'll do something else. And then in the course of the adjustment, most of the time, things change. They say, oh, we said that we would do that, and said they don't do it, or they do more than that or less than that. And there are some countries that are fairly consistent. For example, we found that Canada was a country which was typically quite consistent. If they said, we'll do X, Y, Z in year 1, 2, 3, they actually do it. And the announcement are very sort of credible and they actually materialize. Other countries, I'm afraid to say Italy is the worst offender, they do exactly the opposite. They say, we will do X, Y, Z, and then they do crazy things, and it's very difficult, there's the unexpected changes all over the place. And we have an econometric model that allows for that, allows to take into account expectation, allows to take account in surprises, and of announcement, and of course allows to take into account difference in taxes and spending. So what do we find? If I had this picture, you would see, we look at this, we have the same 17 countries that Daniel collected the data from, minus a couple for some missing data issues having to do with data on confidence. But basically what we found is the following, that once again, tax-based adjustments are much more costly than expenditure-based adjustment. The picture that we have are actually pretty similar to the one that Daniel said, except that tax-based adjustment, tax-based adjustment, they look at as costly as they find. We have a recession of 2, 3, 4% of GDP for a 1% shock 2 or 3 years later. Expenditure-based adjustment they have very, very small recession, actually smaller than the one that came out from Daniel's methodology. In some cases, the economy turns above the initial level very quickly. Canada is one example. So we have an effect of spending cut, which is actually on average not too far from zero. And again, this is an average that if you look at the data, it may come from some cases with the recession has been substantial, and in some cases with the recession has been completely non-existent. The second thing that we find is that consumption behaves in a fairly similar way. There is a decline in consumption, both in the case of tax-based and expenditure-based, but the big difference is on private investment. Private investment jump up when there is expenditure-based adjustment, and they go down with tax-based adjustment. We have data on business confidence and consumer confidence goes down with both type of adjustment. Business confidence goes down much more with expenditure-based adjustment, and much less or not at all with business confidence goes down quite a bit with tax-based adjustment, and it goes down very little, if any at all, with expenditure-based adjustment. And as Daniel correctly pointed out, the causality is an issue. It's unclear whether confidence goes down because the economy is going down, or vice versa, the economy goes down because the causality between confidence and the economy needs to be established, and is difficult with 1 year data. Monetary policy appears to be a tiny bit looser during with expenditure-based adjustment, and inflation is higher with tax-based adjustment, probably because some of the tax-based adjustment are with indirect taxes, which go directly into the price level. So since monetary policy could be an important difference between the two, we looked in the paper. We make some progress at looking at the effect of monetary policy. We do two things. One is very simple, namely we look at fiscal adjustment done in countries within the euro, so they have the same monetary policy, and the results are essentially the same. The difference between expenditure-based and tax-based remains. So, and the second thing, so monetary policy is held constant by definition because these are countries within the euro. And the other thing that we do some econometrics thing to held monetary policy constant, and the difference remain the same. So if monetary policy matters, but a little, but it cannot be the main explanation, and monetary policy is endogenous to these exogenous changes in fiscal policy. So monetary policy will probably react to fiscal policy, for instance, because tax-based adjustment may have an inflationary effect with indirect tax increases, or perhaps because the monetary authorities feel like, well, if these countries are serious and really tackling the growth of spending, then let's help them. But if they do a one-shot tax increase, that's not going to work, and therefore I cannot help. But being as it may, I think monetary policy cannot be the main explanation of the difference between the two. So let me conclude to say a couple of things about current fiscal adjustment. I think it's clearly too early to tell a story. It is perfectly possible, as Daniel suggested, that these fiscal adjustments are more costly than they were in the past because of all the reasons he mentioned, the credit crunch, the zero lower bound, and the aftermath of the financial crisis. However, I think that, at least looking at some example that I know better, the signs are that the difference between tax and spending may in the end remain. And there are two countries, and this is too early to tell for a variety of reasons, because what governments say that they do and then what they actually do is often very different, particularly in moments of crisis like this one. So you read a plan announced by, say, Portugal, and you put in your regression, okay, Portugal is about to do that, and then 3 months later you discover they've done something completely different. So it's still sort of early to see what developed, but there are couple of interesting observations, which is comparing Italy and Ireland. Italy is a country that has a pretty low deficit. In fact, it has a primary surplus and a total deficit because of a very large debt over GDP ratio with the interest payment on it. For a variety of reasons, the Italian government have decided to stay within the 3% deficit rule imposed by the European Union. And what they did is to raise, in the last 3 or 4 years, they raised taxes. They did some minor spending cut, but they basically raised taxes by roughly 1.5% to 2% of GDP in the last couple of years. The result has been the vicious circle that Daniel had mentioned earlier, that is tax, I said that they prohibit the word austerity, tax increases, recession, even a deficit over GDP ratio goes up, debt over GDP ratio goes up, even more tax increases, even more recession, and therefore the debt over GDP ratio in Italy has been growing in the last 3 or 4 years, despite the really draconian tax policies. In fact, because of the draconian tax policies of the Italian government. Ireland, on the other hand, is the opposite extreme. It's a country that is doing a fiscal adjustment essentially all based on the spending side. And after the enormous losses, the enormous deficit caused by the banking crisis. Now that this banking crisis seems to be sort of somehow gone, Ireland is growing at a positive rate, I think 1 or 1.5%, and after a pretty serious spending cut. So at least these are two episodes that seem to be consistent with the difference between spending-based and tax-based. Portugal and Spain are two countries which have done a little bit of both, and I think we are following. We'll see what happens in the end. Greece, I think, is I don't understand. I mean, it's just out of my radar screen. So to conclude, I think that with some slight difference on emphasis, I think that this interesting discussion has led to what I actually find a very, I mean, considering that economists never agree on anything, but I think that on this, I think we have reached a fairly positive sort of core of agreed upon point, namely, just to summarize, that expenditure-based fiscal adjustment are much less costly than tax-based fiscal adjustment. In normal times, when accompanied by a package of accompanying pro-growth policies, the cost of fiscal adjustment on the spending side can be reduced and eliminated. Those accompanying packages are easier to come by in moment when you are not at zero lower bound, you don't have a credit crunch, and you're not in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And therefore, in this particular situation, fiscal adjustment of any type may be more costly than in normal times, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why we have seen this cost. And the final point, again, is that perhaps Europe has made the mistake because of the sort of lack of coordination between banking regulation and banking are separated across country. They have not put their banks in order before engaging in fiscal adjustment, and so they are compounding the effect of the credit crunch with policies that reduce the aggregate demand through mostly tax increases. Thank you.
So I'm going to bring the rest of the panel up and start with a few questions and then bring the audience in. If you do have a question, please raise your hand. I'll call on you, and then you can wait for our assistants to bring microphones. Before you state your question, please just give us your name and any affiliation. So I again just want to thank that this panel's been tremendous. I think that we learned a lot. I hope that for some in the audience who aren't economists, that all these numbers and econometrics that have been thrown around didn't obscure the deeper messages. So one question that I have just to start, so the U.S. Congress is going to be going to a budget conference, I think, this week. And so they're going to be debating fiscal policy prominently, among other things. So let's maybe think about, what could we possibly tell them? A lot of us who are here in Washington are thinking about policy, advising on policy. What can we tell them about this debate? And I have two questions, and I'll ask them sequentially. The first, and we didn't talk about this too much, but I think it's really important. What do we think are the long-run effects? You can call them multipliers, but the long-run effects of fiscal consolidation, tax increases, or spending cuts? So if two or three want to tackle that, and then I'll ask a second question. Daniel.
Okay. Thanks, Salim.
Yeah.
So I think the general view on this is that you get long-run gains from fiscal consolidation, and we've done some work at the IMF in a number of places, but including in that Will It Hurt chapter, where we indeed emphasize that point, that although there may be these short-run costs, the long run can be beneficial. There's one little exception to that we emphasized, which is that if the consolidation is based on cutting public investment, heavily focused on that, cutting infrastructure, then what you can get is a lot of short-run pain and also long-run pain. So, but in general, if you're careful about how you also use the extra space from bringing down debt to cut taxes and use it wisely, then of course I think there's a consensus that it's beneficial.
Great. Vera?
Oh, no, I mean, I agree. I think, like, just looking, as I said, I mean, I think they brought me here to lower the level of the panel. But so, looking at everyone else's work, I mean, it seems clear that there's really a very strong consensus that the long run, I mean, it's a no-brainer. I mean, it should be done. The real question, if I may, is, since one of the things that we see is that you get the biggest gain in the long term by engaging in structural reform, and that we also know that this is not where politicians want to go because they respond to interest groups, how do we get them to do this?
And pushing that question a little further, do we see a difference in the long run between the tax side adjustment and spending side adjustment? Do we expect a difference there, based on literature?
Well, I think, let me say, I think the question is even broader than that. I think we should not avoid talking about the elephant in the room, namely that spending that in the long run, spending cuts or tax increases have a lot to do with your philosophy about the size of government that you want. I mean, if you want to have a very large government with a very generous welfare system and French style or whatever, and maybe it will cost you a little bit in terms of growth, but that's what you want socially, because it's that society wants, that's great. So you mean you say what are the costs? I mean, the costs have to be evaluated in the base of your sort of social welfare function. If you have a social welfare function that wants a large government and perhaps at the cost of some low growth, so be it. If the question is, if you want to maximize growth, yes, probably a large government with a lot of taxes is not a very good thing. But maybe some countries prefer to have lower growth and a different kind of society. So it depends what you mean by cost.
Sure. So my second question, and again, thinking about the budget conference coming up, so we've got some agreements here on things that are good, things that are valuable. For those of us who are in the talking with policymakers and saying, hey, this is where you should put your effort. Of the things that we kind of agree on, do we push them towards structural reforms, or towards getting the fiscal policy right, or towards whatever maximizes short run growth? What's the really if we have to focus on one of those areas? I mean, we'd like all three. If we have to focus on one of those, what's the most important? Kevin, do you want to crack at this?
Because this is, I think, the major policy error of the Obama administration, and it goes back to a talking point that you saw in Hamilton Project things that I think the original author was Larry Summers, that as the recession hit, then there was this notion that the policy had to be temporary, timely, and targeted, or something like that. It sounds a little like Jesse Jackson, right, with the alliteration, but that view that because we were in a crisis, that we should focus on short-term fixes, I think is the biggest policy error that we've made. Because if you think about it, you could open up U.S. fiscal policy and turn to any page, and that page is indefensible. So one of the biggest assets we have is a phenomenally stupid tax code. It's just awful. It's so easy to fix. You could change anything, basically, and make it better. The highest corporate tax in the developed world, for God's sake. That we have all these things that are just fundamentally broken. And the notion that using the political momentum that you could have in a recession to fix broken things is off the table is just a heinous policy error. And that's what we've done. And so we could have used the time to do something like the policy that I mentioned, but pick your policy. Adjust the broken things when you have the political momentum to do something. So now we're not in a crisis. The deficits come down some. The politicians can just do nothing and get away with it. There's nothing to press them to act. And so I think that the sort of what's the focus, what we need to do is we need to focus on long-term solutions that have near-term punch and use the fact that we can fix things in a crisis as like a political opportunity to do the right things. And again, I think that also, finally, that the view of stimulus, of near-term stimulus, that is, Paul Krugman's and the other Keynesians that write a lot, is one that in retrospect is not indefensible. In the idea that if you look at post-war recessions in the U.S., it's almost always the case that they last 11 months and we grow 6% the year after. And if I know that I'm in a recession that's going to last 11 months and I'm going to grow 6% next year, and I know exactly when it starts and when it ends, then sure, I could move some government spending around and make the 6% the next year 4%, and then add a couple percent to this year, and that'd be great if I could do that. But think about what you need to know in order to get all that timing right, and get the shovel-ready projects and all that kind of stuff that you have to have lined up. The fact is that we're in a world where if we could put 2% in this year, we know for a fact that next year, when the equal and opposite effect is about to happen, that we're not going to be willing to take it. Yeah. Because we've got long-run problems and slow growth, and so we need to do things that can make us grow more today, but they need to be things that don't give us a hangover tomorrow, because we're not going to grow 6.5% next year.
That's right. Dan, you wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to comment on the proposal you thought. I thought it was very interesting, your proposal that when you're in a recession, you enact these long-run entitlement reforms that really bring down the present value of the debt, and then you have space to do this, in a sense, tax cuts and stimulate the economy in the short run. That's very interesting. I think, though, in a recession, especially if that cannot be done, there's still some role for this temporary, targeted, transitory stimulus. But I'd like to broaden it a little bit beyond the sort of traditional word of stimulus to the automatic stabilizers, which we haven't talked about that much yet. And automatic stabilizers actually, you know what the automatic stabilizers are. Basically, when there's a recession, taxes fall just automatically. Some unemployment insurance goes up. That's automatically. Basically, automatic stabilizers stabilize by accident. And we need to do a lot more to improve them. This is one of the conclusions of a recent IMF policy paper you can read on reassessing fiscal policy. Basically, the tax code, lots of social choices went into these automatic stabilizers that have nothing to do with stabilization. And so, especially if you're worried about not having shovel-ready projects ready, to go, you want to have smarter automatic stabilizers that can kick in and then kick out, much more quickly than policymakers may be able to do just by taking decisions in Parliament.
Can I respond?
Sure.
I'm on a sort of, I have a pet project, which is that I think that there's no such thing as supply-side economics. That the real problem is that there's demand-side economics, people who think that the only thing that matters is demand, and then there's people who believe in supply and demand. And the problem is that the Democrats and the Keynesians are demand-side economists. That they think that, all we have to do is stimulate demand, and the way to do that is to give money to people or to build a bridge. As soon as we get in a recession, the only thing that can happen is that we can stimulate demand by having the government buy stuff. But that's too one-sided, and the policy doesn't work, and it loses sight of simple things like so, for example, Daniel, let's just say that we cut the corporate tax in half in the U.S. What would happen to equity markets the day you announce that? Well, what would happen? They'd go up a lot, right? So if equity markets go up a lot, what happens to consumption? What happens to demand? Now, what kind of effect is that? Is that a supply side effect or a demand side effect? No, it's a supply and demand effect, right? But this administration and these ideologues, they refuse to accept channels like that. And they condemn us to wasting money on cylindras and cash for clunkers and things like that when there are better things to do. And it's because of the TTT logic that I just wholeheartedly reject. And so I disagree with you.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. And I do want to
Yeah, a
not
follow-up
relitigate
question, though. It's
2009.
One of the things that when we look at the kind of policies that are implemented, I mean, whether they be stimulus, one of the reasons why, even though the literature kind of the value of the multiplier, I think there's really no consensus. I mean, it is pretty much all over the place. And when you look at high stimulus, usually they are, you need conditions that we don't have in the US right now, not to mention that there's the implementation problems of like targeted, is often driven by political decisions. They're not that targeted. They're rarely timely, and they need to be temporary. And you said, in, out. And the temporary is just very rare that it happens, because when you government starts spending money, it's very hard to stop spending it, because you have interest groups that are. So how do you implement policies that are credibly going to be temporary? And my question goes further in terms of, I mean, I like the idea of implementing consolidation that are midterm and credible, that makes credible commitment to reforming structural reforms. But how do we get this credible signal, considering that politicians are politicians and they cater to interest groups? That's, to me, is kind of one of the things that at GMU, obviously, there's like the home of public choice economics.
So Daniel, can you answer that question, and then let's make sure we get in, because we're getting close to 12. I want to get a couple questions from the
Let me
audience.
just say that part of the automatic stabilizers, that's one of their virtues, is that they don't require these policymakers to get their act together and take a decision in a timely manner. That's why we like them, right? But I'd say that there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done on this. There's virtually zero academic research. There's one exception recently with Ricardo Reis and a co-author, but basically very little academic research on how to make this more robust to the political process by making them automatic. And maybe that's because there's been so much focus just on fiscal consolidation recently that we haven't really devoted enough time to thinking about reforming these, which have to do with the tax code and everything else as well. One thing, if I can say, on this, the structural reforms, which you also asked about, we noticed in the discussion there was a lot of, cases where spending cuts can be associated with faster growth if they're coupled together with structural reforms. And I absolutely agree that when countries have limited fiscal space, this is pretty much all we have in some cases. Do structural reforms to boost growth, potential growth. The only thing I wanted to add, and this is a minor, but just I think it's important, is that if you have a spending cut and it's associated with growth, and at the same time you've got, say, trade liberalization or something like that, then I think you want to distinguish the effect of the spending cut from the effect of the trade liberalization, right? And so it's not that the spending cut is no longer contractionary, it's that the trade liberalization, as a separate policy, overwhelmed that. But the spending cut is still contractionary in itself.
So are there any questions? And again, we've got a microphone coming around. Right here.
My name is Salome Saliashvili, and I had a question for Dr. Alesina. You said that certainly some countries would like to have a more social welfare type of state with large government, so they increase taxes to tackle the problems. But situation with Italy, if these increased taxes are giving into a very bad cycle of more recession, and public usually has a very low tolerance for extended periods of recession, why is that policy still pursued? Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I think a couple of things. First, I think we need to distinguish between fiscal adjustment and the size of government. In other words, if Italy had no debt, no deficit, and they chose to have a 60% tax to the GDP ratio and 60% government spending over the GDP ratio, there would be no problem in terms of debt or deficit. There would be no issue of fiscal adjustment, just the choice of very, very high taxes, very large government. So Italy at the moment is not in that situation. They have to do a reduction of the debt over the GDP ratio. So I would refer it to an hypothetical country that does not have to adjust. They just choose to have a very large government sector because that's what their citizens want. But in the case of Italy now, the reason why they're raising taxes rather than cutting spending, I think it's because there are various blocking lobbies and coalitions such that any kind of spending cut is blocked by a particular interest group, and tax increases are easier because you don't have a specific person who protests, it's just the taxpayer as a whole as opposed to a specific group. And second, Italy does things at the last moment always, and we were in a situation with 500 or 600 spread over the German bond rate, so we were the debt. There was a really serious problem of financing the debt, and the quickest thing to do in those situations is to raise taxes, because that's going to the cash machine of the taxpayer, and spending cuts take longer. So it's a combination of a political system that blocks spending cuts and to do things at the last moment when there is no room for doing anything else.
Great. Another question? Will in the back.
Hi. Yes, I'm wondering, Professor Alessina, you mentioned that these two things should be separated, debt and size of government, but there is a relationship, almost certainly, right? That it seems to me, you look at the history of the U.S., periods of high debt to GDP, particularly following World War II, did not lead to good consequences in terms of tax policy, certainly, until 20 years later in the 60s, when Kennedy finally cut tax rates below 90%. And you can say the same thing about the Reagan tax cuts and whatnot. They happened in a period of low deficits initially in debt, and the debt came later. So is there a pattern there internationally, and what is it?
I would think something actually very, very simple, that we need to distinguish the issue of fiscal adjustment and how to do it in the best possible way to limit short-term cost with the issue, more philosophical issue of do I want a society like France or with 60%
Don't look
spending?
at me.
Or a country with a much smaller government. Now, yes, the two things sometimes are related, because often the government spending has increased in various periods with accumulation of debt, which has created its own problem. But I would just simply try to distinguish between what is fiscal sustainability with the level of GDP and taxes. You can have a country which is a perfectly sustainable zero debt and a very large government, or a country with reasonably small government, but a very big Japan, with a very small, fairly small government with a huge debt. So the two things are kept are separate. And then there's the issue of wars. I mean, wars are obviously historically the biggest, together with huge financial crises, are the ones that accumulated large debt. And in the Second World War, most countries got out of debt with growth, including the U.S. Unfortunately, now it will be much harder to get out of debt with growth, because it's hard to imagine that the OECD country will grow now at the speed in which we're growing in the 50s and 60s. So that's why the situation is much more complicated.
There's an interesting thing to add, which is that in the optimal tax literature, there's a clear optimal government policy which, when described, sort of defeats itself as a reductio ad absurdum, maybe, which means optimal tax literature is not so useful. That what the optimal tax, which you see in like Chomley and Judd, is to basically tax old capital today and give government a big enough surplus so that it can finance future government spending on the interest on the surplus, and set all taxes to zero, effectively.
Wow.
As
right?
long as you do it unexpectedly.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, but in time zero.
Don't tell anyone, Kevin.
But in time zero, the government gets this huge surplus, and then it uses the interest on the surplus to set taxes to zero. And I mean, if there's human capital too, so then everything's kind of capital, then all the taxes are zero. But we would never want to let government do that, right? Because we would know that as soon as we gave them the surplus, that they would waste it. And so that, but that defines defines the problem, though. Right, so that the sort of the models that we economists use to think about your question have the limit that in the end, the thing that at the margin matters most is something that economists know nothing about.
So I'm just gonna close with a final question to Professor Alesina. Again, thinking again about our Congress. I know that so we said this before. He's written on a lot of different literature. So one of those is political economy. So what are the political costs that tend to be associated or not with cutting spending?
Just like that?
Sure. Or I mean, you can.
It's a pretty simple, pretty difficult question you're asking. Well, I mean, the one, I think that, let me give you an answer, not so much on the US, but more generally. My sense of the literature is that there is actually several papers, one by Alan Dresen and somebody else. I also have a paper on in this volume that you mentioned that shows that surprisingly, the electoral cost of reducing deficit, either by raising taxes or cutting spending, is not that large, surprisingly. I mean, governments that have reduced deficit are not, on average, more likely to be thrown out of office than government that did nothing. In fact, I have weaker results, but I think Brender and Dresen on the AER of a couple of years ago, they have a result is actually even stronger. They show with a quite convincingly, is in the AER, that actually reducing deficit helps government to be re-elected. So the easiest answer to your question will be, well, because the government politicians that do that, they lose the next election. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think, particularly in the talk about spending cut, I mean, I think it's a lot more to do with vocal groups, objecting to this cut or that cut, while the sort of the medium voter would be much more easily convincible. I think in that, to put it differently, I would use a model not so much of the medium voter voting against that, but I would use a model of lobbying, fighting with each other, and stopping this cut or that cut, and instead rather than a vote. So I think the costs are more to do with lobbying pressure than with the associated campaign contribution and all of that, more than an electoral cost.
There was also an IMF edited book by the IMF called Chipping Away Our Debt that actually reviews all the fiscal adjustment of the last 30 years and that looks at this issue and concludes the same, which is like it doesn't really have an electoral cost.
Great.
Of course, it's very hard to generalize
Yeah.
the situation with that, but on average,
Yeah.
if you run regression of electoral result over fiscal policy, you don't find what we all think you should see, namely that government that reduce deficits are thrown out of office. It's something that's much more complicated than that.
Good. Well, thank you so much. Can you all join me in thanking the panel?